Hey fearsome friends, welcome back. I hope you didn't miss me too much. The deep dark woods can be a beautiful place during the day. But as soon as that sun goes down, it can be one of the most terrifying places on earth. From Bigfoot to Banshees, here are 10 terrifying deep woods stories to lull you off to sleep tonight. So sit back, relax, get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. I was a sophomore in high school when this happened, and I haven't gone back since. It was midsummer in New England, and my best friend, let's call him Andy, and I were hanging out. Now I live on conservation land, so aside from the houses at the very front, there are no other developments, and there is woodland that spans for acres and acres. Now the state had laid down some paths, so I suggested we go exploring. We geared up, and I brought my pocket knife, sprayed down in bug spray, and headed out my backyard. We hadn't explored too much before, but I knew the area somewhat, so we decided, to hell with the trails. We're going to be real men and forge our own path. We entered the woods, thickly forested with pine, maple, and oak trees, and made notches in them on the way so we could find our way back. It had gotten to around noon, so I wasn't too worried about it getting dark. After all, the sun set around 8 p.m. in the summer, so we made our way deeper and deeper into the woods. After about 15 minutes, the forest was alive with bugs, frogs, and birds, etc. Everything there was loud, and quite honestly a bit irritating, but it was nice to take in the sights and sounds. After a while, we stumbled upon a peculiar scene. There was a perfect circle clearing, probably 20 feet in diameter, that spanned from the ground all the way up to the sky. I was perplexed, but Andy was curious, so we decided to enter the circle. I noticed that the overgrown weeds and grass that surrounded us stopped at the perimeters, and past the line it was all dead. Not bare, but dead, and crunched under our feet. I don't just mean the grass, but the tree limbs that extended into that area were also bare. The leaves down the branch, until it got to the perimeter, were dead. Now, being the middle of summer, nothing should be dead, and I've never seen a branch behave like that. I was feeling an extreme unease, and turned to Andy to ask if he felt the same. He said he felt like we were being watched, and I agreed. It was just then that we noticed the strangest thing. The entire forest had gone silent. Not in rest, though, but in what felt like suspense. I was feeling very nervous now, and decided that it was time to leave. We ran out of there, following the tree marks we'd made earlier, and when we got back to my house, the forest suddenly came alive again. Ever since then, every summer and every winter, a snarl of branches, sometimes leafed, sometimes not, reveals our path through the forest. I swear that whatever was watching us from that circle peers through and wants us to come back. My account is not dramatized or exaggerated. If you have any ideas as to what is out there, please let me know. I'm still not sure what to make of it. So this story, I feel, is more than just creepy woods, but I can't explain it. It could have been some sort of mass hysteria, or a group hallucination that lasted multiple days. Maybe even shared sleep paralysis, but I doubt it. About 10 years ago, I was a cocky little so-and-so, an 18-year-old dude who thought he had the world by the balls, but later discovered it was actually the other way around. And I was with my very serious girlfriend of 2 years and counting. It was the first time I'd ever dated a girl. It really felt like I was in love, and I could see myself marrying her. Although thank goodness that didn't happen. So my parents are really strict conservative Christians. They'd never let me and my girlfriend Caitlin share a room at night, but Caitlin's parents, on the other hand, couldn't have cared less. They'd let us drink, and we had our own bedroom upstairs. But looking back on it, her mum wasn't really the best mother, but she was nice enough. One weekend during the summer, Caitlin and her parents asked if I'd like to come 3 hours up north to her grandparents' town for their anniversary. Now this place is hours away from any civilization, and is as secluded as it gets. You pass Amish people all the way up to northern Michigan. I said hell yeah. Her grandparents are wealthy and outgoing, so I knew it'd be a fun time. But unfortunately there were too many people staying in their big, lovely house, so we had to rent a cabin in the woods. Now this cabin was at least 20 minutes from the village or town, and right away it felt off. It was way, way back in the woods, and off this creepy, secluded, quiet dirt road. Everything was silent, and the houses next to us were dead silent and empty. It was just us. Now I wasn't worried about it at all, because I had this wonderful and fleeting confidence that alcohol and the possibility of getting some action this weekend was on the cards. We had a regular fun time with family, then returned to our cabin for the night, and our room was upstairs in this sort of loft area. The cabin was old, rustic, and just empty. Not physically empty, just void of something. It had an empty atmosphere. But hey, we're way out in the woods, and no one had probably been there in ages, so of course it felt dead in there. But that night something happened, and I'm positive I'll miss a bunch of details, because I blocked it out of my memory until I saw this sub. Then it all came flooding back. So Caitlin and I were sleeping on this god-awful mattress as I was drifting off to end up having the most horrible nightmares. But they were more than that. They felt real. It was as though my soul was able to move around and interact with the bedroom our bodies were lying in as we slept, but I was awake. The bedroom was dark, and the moonlight from the window lit up the center of it, where there were so many people, and they were all dead, standing in a circle and chanting. In the center of the circle, I could see a little girl with blonde hair who was maybe 7 years old and was wearing a white dress and almost glowing in the most disturbing way. They all turned to me watching, then slowly approached me, all chanting and murmuring. I can't remember what words they were saying exactly, but I'm positive they were performing some kind of ritual and sacrificing and murdering this little girl. It was a bit like the scene from Rosemary's Baby, which is something I'd never seen until very recently. They came at me with their hands outstretched, looking dead and rotten, and as they began to strangle me, I woke up. Upon waking up, you'd think that everything would go back to normal. But no. I saw the rocking chair in the room, and it was rocking, like flying as if someone had body slammed it. At this point I thought, nope, forget this, and closed my eyes again, hoping and praying the sun would rise really soon. But it didn't. I fell back to sleep and immediately went into another dream. In this one I was on a roller coaster with all sorts of people, and it was going straight up into the sky to heaven. I was feeling happy and was cheering, but just before we got through the pearly gates, the roller coaster started to descend straight down into the earth, into the fire and into hell. All I could hear was blood-curdling screams for help and pain. There was so much agony and terror, and it was the most awful thing I'd ever experienced. I could even feel the heat of the fire and the pain of the screams surrounding me. I finally woke up and it was morning. I was covered in sweat, and when I looked over to see my girlfriend, she was in the fetal position, shaking and crying. I asked her what was wrong, already knowing the answer, but hoping it was something else. Then all she could say was, "The girl. The girl." I asked her what had happened, and she told me she'd seen a little girl in a white dress, standing in the middle of the room, staring at us and dancing, but she claimed she wasn't even asleep. She went on to explain how she'd woken up periodically to see the rocking chair just rocking, and I hadn't even told her what I'd seen, because she'd just confirmed everything, which only made it worse. The next 2 nights I didn't sleep, but there was a porn stars marathon on TV, thank goodness, so I stayed up all night with the lights on, blasting porn stars to stay awake, and I didn't sleep again until the car ride home. Caitlin and I talked about it maybe once or twice, but never spoke of it again. I'll never know what actually happened that night, or if I was just going crazy, but all I can say for sure is that I'm never going anywhere near that town again, and as much as I'd like answers to what this might have been, I'd rather just forget about it. The following story is 100% true. The years listed above are the estimated dates that this story roamed free for me, 1987 to 2012. It was the only time in my entire life that I ever questioned my own sanity and/or my own perceptions. I ask that you read this story in full, as this is one of those few cases where there is an actual ending to the story. And I'm writing this today because I believe this story is one we can all learn from. It was in a mid-sized city, located roughly 2.5 hours southwest of Chicago. The town sits right on the Mississippi River, bordering the state of Iowa. And the lady in the woods was sighted at a small park, smack dab in the middle of town. The park is surrounded by roughly 4 to 5 acres of timber. Sometime in roughly 1993 to 1994 was the first time I heard about the lady in the woods. I was in 5th grade, hanging out with some other boys on the grade school grounds. The story is your typical ghost story. At Mel Park, our local hangout, just blocks away, a child went missing after the sighting of a ghost. Well, more specifically, the ghost of a woman dressed all in white. They didn't know the name of the child, but claimed it happened in 1987. Another boy chimed in to say there was also an adult who went missing the night after a sighting of this same ghost a few years later. In both cases, the sightings happened after the park closed, well after midnight. The park is nestled in between neighborhoods, and there have even been reports of people who have moved out of their homes after seeing the woman drift through the woods. There were other stories I heard in the years after that included witchcraft, Satan worshipping, kidnapping, murder, and the occult. The story gained more momentum when another boy in our class, a few months later, found a pentagram spray-painted on a tree on a path near the park. We actually rode our bikes out to see it, and it was definitely there, crudely painted in what looked like a real hurry. It was one of those things where there was no real way to know if the pentagram was part of the story or was put there because of the story. When you're in 5th grade, you rarely stop to think these things through. You only see what's in front of you, and what I was seeing was definitely creepy. May 1995. A friend of ours named Michael lived only a block away from Mel Park. His parents decided to allow him to have a sleepover for his birthday party. He invited 10 of us boys to stay the night, just doing what boys do. God bless those parents, by the way. And that night you can imagine where this thing headed. Michael knew all the Mel Park ghost stories, and he lived the closest of all of us. He had a neighbour who gave him all kinds of crazy information, or so he claimed, and he'd rehashed a lot of the stories we'd already heard, and even added a few others. After some time, and as the clock made its way near to 1 a.m., it finally happened. One of the boys suggested we sneak out, see if we could find this lady ghost. So that's exactly what we did. We all made it outside, quiet enough, and made our way to Mel Park. Once we'd got there, we broke up into groups. A few walked to the overgrown Little League baseball field, and a few headed towards the playground equipment, near the only streetlight in the park. Myself and another stayed in the parking lot, nearest to Michael's house. Yes, we were the skittish ones. I wish I could tell you all kinds of cool things we did, but in real life it's not that cool. Essentially, we just kind of walked around, looking and waiting. We had only been there for maybe 15 to 20 minutes, and then it happened. It was like a Lifetime movie. There she was, in the woods, to my north. I could see what looked like a pale white woman, white hair, white flowing clothes and white pants. In the night she looked to glow. It was literally the perfect example of what you would think of as a ghost. I have never been so scared in my entire life, and to this day it is still the most terrifying moment I've ever been in, and that includes a car accident. Everyone saw her, all 10 of us. She stuck out like a sore thumb. And at that moment, we jetted. I mean, we ran faster than any of us had ever run before. All of us completely silent, moving at our fastest rate, towards Michael's home and safety. I could embellish here and tell you that she chased us or made a move towards us. I could make it out like her head split in half and bees came flying out. But none of that happened. In fact, she was facing a different way entirely. I don't believe the ghost lady even knew we were there. She looked as if she was simply peering deeper into the woods, as opposed to staring out at us, frightened little boys running away terrified. So that was that. We all made it back safely, and spent the rest of the night worried this lady ghost was going to show up and kidnap us. But of course she never showed. We returned to school and the Lady of the Woods became a legend. All of us share the story. All of us back each other up. And we even told one of our teachers, who politely listened and then changed the subject. It was the coolest, most terrifying thing that had ever happened to us, and we had one of the best campfire ghost stories in history. So time passed, like it does, and we moved on from grade school to junior high, then to graduating high school. Once we got a little older, the story took a back seat to girls and just living life. I wouldn't say the story died. I know we spoke of it in passing. And I know it continued on in grade school, at least for a short time after we'd left. However, one of the 10 boys from the birthday party died of suicide shortly after high school, and it took everything in me not to blame this ghost story on that situation. I don't believe the two are related. We all moved on to college. I lost touch with all but one of the 10, though a few of them I still have on Facebook. 2010, after coming home from college and struggling to find my way in life, I finally started to get my act together. I found a full-time job, married my now wife, got a dog and even had a couple of kids. Eventually we purchased our first home, which so happened to be just blocks from my childhood house. I ended up in a tiny little house 2 streets over from Mel Park. After those floating years, I ended up back where it all started. On my days off, I walked my dog in the very park where the Lady of the Woods scared me almost to death. This is where you really start to question yourself and your senses. At 27 years old, I would stare at the location where I saw that lady glowing all those years prior, and try to make sense of it all. Now older and wiser, you spend a lot more time trying to feel things out, rather than just reacting. How in the world did I see a ghost in 6th grade with 9 other people who all saw the same thing? I know it wasn't a dream. How could we be collectively dreaming? I know it wasn't imagination. It was really there. What I saw was real. But your brain has a funny way of making things fuzzy. It's hard to explain, but you start to question everything. You know it's real, but you know it's not. That sentence shouldn't be, but that's just how my mind would read the situation. It really was something I wrestled with a bit, just trying to figure it all out. Summer of 2012. There I am, on another walk with my dog, coming up alongside the timber where I saw the Lady in the Woods all those years ago. I was thinking of her again. I was thinking of my childhood friends, and wondering if they ever think of that moment like I do. The thought passes as I move along a path that leads me out of the park. In front of me, a large trailer hooked up to a pickup sits in the driveway nearest the park's wooded area. There was a middle-aged man moving some things onto the trailer as I approached. He saw me and said, "Hello." I said hello back and then decided to make some small talk. I asked him if he was moving. The man responded that he had just recently sold the home. It was his parents' house and he had sold it to a young couple. Closing was coming up shortly. I mentioned a few other things and then started to head off. But I stopped, because that ghost story was on my mind. So I decided to ask a man I didn't know if he knew the story. Why I did that is beyond me. It's definitely not something I would normally bring up in conversation. But this house was the closest one to the sighting, and I just needed confirmation that somebody else out there still knew the story. I don't exactly remember what he said, but I basically asked him if he had ever heard the ghost stories. I'll never in my remaining years forget what happened next. The man looked at me and smiled, and told me he's heard those stories plenty. I was actually relieved he had, because I didn't actually think through how the conversation would go if he had no clue what I was talking about. I then proceeded to give him the shortened version of the story of me and my friends all those years ago. He listened, and I could tell he was interested. Then when I finished, he took a moment and responded. "I used to live in this house before the park was built. My parents raised me here. I moved out in 1983 or 84. I believe the park was built somewhere between 84 and 86, and my parents have been here ever since. My dad passed away in 91, and it was just my mum after that. That ghost you saw, that was my mum." I looked at him completely confused. He continued, "My mum had some medical issues that started in the mid-80s and continued all the way up until she passed away this last spring. The medicine they had her on would cause her to sleepwalk. I can't even count the amount of times I received calls in the middle of the night from the police department advising me that they had found my mother wandering in the park. I was told recently one of the neighbours moved out because they were tired of all the commotion. My sister lives in Texas. I could never get it through her thick skull that our mum needed to be moved to assisted living, so this went on for years. I found out from some friends that she had become a ghost story in the park. You see, my mum had a favourite robe that was all white and always slept in the same pearl silk pyjamas. Everything was white. She even had white gloves she would put on from time to time. I can only imagine what that would look like in the middle of the night. That lamp there over the playground would light her up like a Christmas tree, so it was never hard for police to locate her. You see, that ghost you saw, that was just Mum sleepwalking probably. I bet I even got a call that night." I was speechless. The lady in the woods was real, but she wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a dream. She was simply a woman. She was this man's mother, lonely and suffering from some medical condition that had her wandering the woods at night. I only wish I knew more. I never saw that man again. The new couple moved in, probably oblivious to the ghost story its previous occupant had created. So I wonder, does her legend live on? Is there some fifth graders right now hearing the story for the first time of the lady in the woods and how she appears and kidnaps children? How there is a witch who murders those who see her in the middle of the night? 2021. I've moved from that tiny house to a new bigger house in a new city. I no longer visit Mel Park, and I never did learn that lady's name. I always kick myself for not asking the man more questions. The thing that I find so interesting is how a story can become what it is, how one event can impact individuals like it did me. I still think of that lady all the time. When a story rolls out that seems impossible, The lady in the woods comes to mind. Sometimes the story is real, but the context is muddled. This single event impacted my approach to everything. I now listen, I take in all of the story I can, and if it seems impossible, I hold my tongue. Maybe it is impossible, or maybe it's just being interpreted wrong. I live in the state of Georgia, in a rural town not far from a major city. There's a set of woods that's behind our house that divides two neighborhoods, and it's about a mile wide, if that. Strange occurrences have always surrounded these woods. Small things like random trash, tarps, etc. I should mention it's more swampy marsh than woods, so it makes camping in there impossible. One night I was taking our dog out. He usually stays in the back half of the house, due to him not liking our other dogs. So I took him out the side door, and we walked around the house to the fence. But for some reason, when we left the house, he was absolutely terrified. He didn't want to go out, which is very unusual for a dog who's quick to snatch someone's soul if prompted. Not thinking anything of it though, we pushed onwards. After he tinkled, we walked back, and this is when I noticed it, or rather heard it. Crunching of leaves. At first I thought it was one of our dozen cats on the property, until I realized it was matching my steps. If I walked, you could hear it walking. If I stopped, it stopped. Now there's a small clearing between the woods and where one of our sheds are, and that's when we saw it. My dog was first to see something, and then I saw some, creature. It was taller than the shed, so maybe a good 8 feet tall, and it darted across the clearing at a crazy fast speed. Again, my dog, who isn't scared of anything, bolted so fast I dropped his leash, and he ran to the door whining, and I was quickly behind him. Once we were inside, I quickly bolted the door and ran to tell my girlfriend what had happened. She immediately wanted to investigate, saying it was probably a woodland creature. So armed with 2 flashlights, we went out the front door, and as we walked towards the wood line, we could hear something moving around. It sounded maybe 200 yards away. As we scanned with our flashlights, we saw nothing, but kept hearing it. Then we heard it get closer and closer, until it was maybe 20 feet away. Still nothing. No eyes. Not even an animal call. Just rustling. My girlfriend, now scared, headed for the house, and I decided to check with the neighbors to see if maybe one of their many dogs got out. When I arrived at his house, my neighbor, who we'll call Dave, explained that all his dogs were accounted for. Curious, he came to investigate too, and this is when I noticed that whatever this thing was had followed me along the woodline to Dave's house and was now behind it. Gun in hand, we went into his backyard, scanning for something. We could hear it rustling, or maybe running, about 100 yards away in thick swampy woods. It was way too thick for a person to walk in, let alone run in. But then it stopped. It was dead silent. Scanning and on edge, we heard and saw nothing, and then bam! All of a sudden it was 5 feet in front of us, sprinting at me. It slammed the fence so hard it rocked it back and forth. Dave, who was terrified now, shot randomly at, nothing. We never saw it, and never heard it get close to us. Again, as I mentioned, the woods are thick, too thick to run in. So what the hell teleported silently in front of us and slammed the gate? Spooked out, we were about to run. Then we heard it. It was human in nature, but not English. It sounded alien-like, not a known language. Now Dave, a hunter for the last 40 years, still to this day can't explain what that was. After we'd heard the last, We bolted. He covered me and I ran to my house, and not 10 minutes later we both heard a loud explosion coming from the woods. It shook our houses and flickered our power. I ran outside to see what it was, and of course nothing. But when Dave came out and confirmed he'd felt the same thing, we were both once again terrified. Moments later, a few strangers from the neighborhood came driving down to our cul-de-sac, and they all agreed the blast sound they'd heard had come from behind our house. 911 was called, and the 2 police officers interviewed us separately. Our stories matched. The responding officers refused to go anywhere near those woods. They took the report and left, and to this day we're still not sure what that was. Also, Dave doesn't go outside at night anymore. It spooked him that badly. The next night, earlier in the day, my mother-in-law, a police officer for a town 40 minutes away, installed 2 motion-activated trail cams along the wood's edge. They were brand new, and keep that detail in mind. Now, thinking maybe we'd see something, we waited for nightfall, and later that evening I went outside to feed our outdoor cats. And that's when I heard it again. Rustling. This time, not taking any chances, I ran inside and told everyone what I'd heard. They all piled by the back door and urged me to go out there and look. Reluctantly, I agreed. So I took my flashlight and walked to the edge of the woods. Knowing there was a trail cam covering this area, I figured if it got me, it would be on camera, and my sacrifice wouldn't be for nothing. As I got to the wood's edge, I could hear it still rustling. I was shaking at this point, because I could tell it was maybe less than 15 yards in front of me. Everyone at the door was watching me and could hear this thing. But then it got quiet, and for a moment it was gone, or so I thought. Just as I was scanning with my flashlight, trying desperately to see a normal woodland creature so I could laugh this whole thing off, boom! Something fell out of a tree and hit the ground so hard it shook the soil beneath my feet. It was so close, too, that I was sure it was going to lunge out and snag me. I dropped my flashlight and ran 100 yards back to the house in what felt like 2 seconds. I screamed, "Get in the house!" as everyone was already scampering in. They heard and felt the thud too, and our neighbour Dave called my mother-in-law to ask what the loud crash was. For him to have heard it from well over 700 yards away is insane to me. Once the adrenaline died down, we realised that this happened right next to the trail cam. Problem solved. We got evidence of this thing. The next morning we checked the SD cards on the trail cams. They have videos up until 11:47 p.m, and the rest is corrupted. They were both brand new trail cams and SD cards. We reset everything and set them back up, and to this day we've still never encountered the creature again, nor caught anything on the cameras. My spouse and I met in our first year of college around 14 years ago. We spent a few weeks as acquaintances in a large group of friends and didn't really get to meet one another properly until this event. For a little bit of backstory, our group of friends loved to take walks in the woods. Our campus was surrounded by forest. But unfortunately, everyone had class or work during the day, so we'd often wait until night time when everyone was free. We were so comfortable in the woods at night, it just felt like a perfectly natural thing to do. However, this particular night, which happened to be the night before Halloween, a bunch of our friends were dropping out for one reason or another. Homework, tiredness, or tests. And eventually, the last ones being, besides my future husband and I, dropped out too. But considering that he and I didn't know each other that well yet, our friend told us we should go on a walk together anyway. It was a little awkward, but we were both friendly people, so we decided to be adventurous and make the best of it. We headed out into the woods, and decided to walk down the path that would take us to a place called Altar Site, named because it had a log, kind of shaped like an altar, where college students often left knickknacks and stuff. But unfortunately, in the dark we didn't know this path very well, and came to realize that we were becoming quite lost. We joked about having to spend the night out there, and I said, "I hope you aren't afraid of survival cuddling." After about 45 minutes of walking in what seemed like circles, we started to realize that this might not be a joke, and decided we should pick a line and start walking as straight through the woods as we could. We were hoping this would get us out because we knew that the entire section of woods was surrounded by roads or ocean, and we would know what to do when we hit one or the other. It was pretty rough ground. We walked into trees, rivers, swamps, and just kept going for another hour or so, until we stumbled out onto what seemed like a larger trail than what we had been on. By this point we started following the trail, hoping that it was a main one, and we could use it to find our way out. I was so relieved. I remembered jumping out onto it, smiling and saying, "We're going to be okay. This will surely get us out." We followed it out into a small meadow, where we unfortunately lost sight of the trail again, but hoped that we would see it again in the woods on the other side. We walked across the meadow and entered the tree line on the other side, only to realize that the trail had disappeared. We were about to turn around when we suddenly heard a loud and crisp, bloody scream in the woods nearby. It must have lasted something like 10 seconds and felt really close. The sound can only be explained as a pig-bird woman screaming bloody murder. We stood there for a second and then asked each other, "What was that?" Not knowing, I suggested we headed back into the meadow, where we could kind of see things. Arriving there, we just stood for a few minutes, not sure what to do. We couldn't find the trail, and something just screamed in the woods, and it was a dreadful feeling, knowing we weren't alone, but had no idea how to get away from whatever it was. Then suddenly, I heard a thick branch on the ground in the tree line near us snap, and a thick bushy tree near it started to shake, like something had moved in it. Another scream. Whatever it was definitely right under the tree next to us. The scream lasted what felt like 15 seconds, and was definitely longer than the first one. I remember suddenly hugging this guy that I was with, out of fear. It was kind of awkward, but I remember apologizing afterwards. If he hadn't have been scared out of his wits, then the hug would have been more enjoyable. And that it was kind of nice having this girl latch onto him like her life depended on it. I thought it was the last hug I was ever going to get, though. By this point we were at a loss on what to do, and I remember turning and looking behind us, and making out what looked could be a trail curving around a bend. I guess we had missed it earlier, because we had walked into the meadow thinking it was the trail. I pointed it out to him, and we got back to back and started heading up the new trail path. We had brought our crappy flip phones with us, hoping to use them as flashlights. The brighter one had died earlier, but mine was still working. Unfortunately, though, I couldn't see anything with it. I just started flipping it open and shut, hoping it might scare whatever was out there. When we got about 20 paces up the trail, we started to hear a pattern of noise behind us. Since it was fall, the trail was covered in leaves, but because it had been walked through a lot during the day, the leaves in the center of the trail were flattened, but the leaves on the side were still crunchy, and I kept hearing them on one side being stepped on. Then silence. The leaves on the other side of the trail started crunching. It sounded like something was moving from side to side behind us on the trail, trying to get around my sight of vision. And that's when we heard it scream one more time. It was right behind us. We started running. Stupid, I know, but it was only about another 20 more paces, and suddenly we were out of the woods and in a large meadow that we both thankfully recognized. We ran to the other side of it and got to the paved road right near the campus. Nothing followed us out of the woods, but we did hear the thing scream one more time from the tree line. We ran back to our dorm rooms, promising to talk about what the hell happened in the morning, as it was so late at night at this point. But we were both pumped with adrenaline from shared terror. I tried looking up what it was that night with my headphones on in the dark dorm room while my roommate slept. I'd had some woodland experience in my time, and I wanted it to be the sound of a screeching owl. I looked and listened to all the screeching birds in the region, but nothing sounded quite right. They were all very screechy and bird-like, but the edge of human-like vocals just wasn't in anything I found. So I went to bed. We told our friends about it in the morning, and it became an instant campus urban legend. People called it the Banshee in the Woods. Some people wanted to make it into a documentary project, but it just stayed a local legend for a couple of years before fading away with all the other noise of campus life. Most of our friends had heard the story by that point, so I was surprised when one friend of ours couldn't recall it. We told him the story and described the sounds in the best detail we could. Then he said, "I know exactly what you heard. That was a cougar." Well, goddamn. I looked it up. I don't know why I hadn't thought of it before. I knew the cats could scream like women, but I had never heard it before, despite my woodland experience. Funnily enough, though, I did know from some of my tracker friends that cougars often follow 5 to 6 month-long territory walks, so I started keeping an ear out for cougar sightings and activity around campus. And sure enough, I was able to track down people who had seen the cat about half a year after our encounter, with no sightings in between, and some articles about sightings around a year after our incident. I found some people who had found a kill site on campus around 6 months after that. We could track the cat's routine visits to the campus to line up very squarely with ours. Now, we only lasted a couple more weeks as friends, and I don't know if it was the experience in the woods or if it was just us, but we both desired more than just friendship. It wasn't a clean transition. We had both just come from a relationship a few weeks before we'd met, and I was terrified that he was rebounding. We both took the winter slow and examined our thoughts. Then we came back after the new year, and there was no doubt. It has been over 14 years now, and a few years ago at our wedding, we told the story to our whole reception, and surprisingly still had friends and family that hadn't heard it. We are both freelance and spend most of each day together working creatively. We walked in those woods practically strangers, and it sparked something that I never thought I would find. It wasn't scare-free, though. Trauma brought us together, but it also had its cost on my mental well-being. I started noticing it just a couple of months after the event, that I was sometimes having panic attacks in the woods at night. Just the slightest noise I didn't recognize, and I would be filled with dread, almost paralyzed and begging those around me to get me out of the forest. For me, that has been a big cost. I grew up walking the woods at night. I had become so comfortable with it, to lose that as an adult felt a little humiliating. I like to think I have made progress over the last 14 years in pushing it back, but all it takes is the right conditions to bring it all back. So at this time, we lived in a house that had an outhouse, no indoor toilet. We had running water, but just couldn't get a proper septic system in there. The outhouse was up the hill a ways, about 30 yards. This was in a valley, and the nearest neighbour was roughly 4 miles away. So good luck if you needed emergency service. We had 3 dogs, the biggest of all being a lab mix named Boo Bear that we called Boo. Boo was a very loyal and territorial dog. It didn't matter what time of day it was. He'd go with you up to the outhouse and sit outside. This was normal behaviour for years. I'm getting goosebumps thinking about him and welling up with tears. He was such a good dog. One night my mum needed to go, and he went with her. We'd normally just walk up and do our business and head back and go back to sleep. We had no AC, just windows and fans. So Boo followed Mum up there, and this time he was between Mum and the woods. There was a solid tree line around the house that you couldn't see into at all. But I'd get my ass back to the house before it even got close to dark. Boo felt or heard something. The more my mum tried to get up, the more he was growling. He had never behaved this way. My mum, a devout Baptist, swears on the Bible that she heard what sounded like grunting coming from out of the woods. She could feel something either stomping or punching the ground. My mum was raised by some serious hillbillies and isn't scared of anything in the woods, so she forced her way up there, as she thought it was a deer, because they'll do that in rut season. Boo set out there growling, and she said every hair he had on him was standing up straight. He wasn't barking, but she could feel his growling. I don't know how to describe it. It's like the bass you feel from a subwoofer. She got done and came back to the house, and there were no other issues that night. However, a few nights later, a friend was staying at my house, and he was one of the ones that was with me when we saw whatever it was that we saw. This was actually prior to the encounter with my mum by a year or two. He grew up poor like us, but he was a good dude. His mum and dad were great. It was about 11 or 11:30 p.m. on a Friday or Saturday, because we had a 10 p.m. bedtime on weeknights, and we were playing Killer Instinct on the N64. Now when I say this scared me, I thought my mum was being killed. We heard a scream and felt a noise come from the woods about 150 yards up that mountain. My buddy and I had goosebumps coming up like crazy, and we didn't say a word. I just kept playing, thinking that my brain was playing tricks on me. Then 5 minutes later it happened again. And this time it was maybe 75 to 100 yards up, and it was heading down. I stopped and I asked my friend if he had heard it, and he said, yeah, I heard it the first time too. Fight or flight kicked in, and we were in a panic. I checked on my mum and my little brother, and both were fine. I woke up my little bro and told him what was going on, and we grabbed our rifles. I only had a 30-06, and my friend had my 20 gauge. My little brother had a 22, and we parked our asses in the room we were in when we first heard it. Now when I say my heart was racing, if it was doing the 100-meter dash, it would have beaten Usain Bolt. We didn't hear anything for 30 minutes. We had the windows open due to no AC, and we had the fans off. Then we started hearing a noise coming from the woods. It sounded like something was slowly plodding down the ridge to the house, just walking. I know it was no cat. You'll never hear a big cat. I've had cougars surprise me, and I never heard a thing. No, this was big. It was making a lot of racket. We just kept sitting there, ears on alert. Then we heard a scream again. This one shook our windows, literally. There was nothing at that point we could have done. It was within 25 yards of our house, and we were petrified. Boo was just pacing back and forth. He wanted to get out, but I didn't want him to go, and neither did my brother or my friend. He was our safety blanket in that moment. So we decided to just hang out in there when we started hearing the grunting. All I can say is, I've heard deer in rut season. This was way too guttural. This feeling of dread came over us all, and we all started bawling. We legitimately felt like we were going to die. Mum finally woke up and came in. She saw us all holding our guns. She was wondering what the hell we were all doing. I put my hand up to my face, and she'd seen that we were crying. I put my index finger to my mouth and made the shush sound. The grunting kept going, louder and louder. Then the pounding started. It wasn't hitting a tree or anything. It was hitting the ground, like punching the hell out of it. We could feel each hit. Mum said this is what she had heard the other night, but that she didn't think much of it. But whatever this was seriously scared me. The grunting and pounding eventually stopped, and Mum decided to send Boo out. Nicky and Bella, our other dogs, didn't do anything. Boo was just a badass, and we were his family. Once let out, he beelined it up there, and that was it. We heard one yelp and then nothing. We didn't hear anything else that night, or for several days after. Boo was gone and we were all shaken up. I think it was 5 or 6 days later when my stepdad went to use the outhouse, and laying next to the building was Boo. I swear on my life that this dog was literally torn apart. There were no bite marks. It wasn't a cat. He had literally been ripped apart limb from limb. I don't know what it was. Could have been a bear, I don't know. I know that we moved out of there a month later, and that damned place can't keep people in it anymore. I can't say that I smelled anything or anything like that. The outhouse smelled pretty damn gnarly, and was definitely one of the worst experiences of my life. I always wanted to try the car life thing, after watching so many YouTubers who live in their cars and travel around the country. I lived in Fort Lauderdale for 5 years, and thought I would be stuck there and that was it. But then the pandemic hit, and when I checked my bank account, I was back paid thousands of dollars. So before I knew it, I was packing up all my stuff, and the landlord said it was fine to leave all my furniture. Now I was on the I-95 heading north, laughing to myself as I couldn't believe I was actually leaving. Fast forward some time, and I'd managed to get a hang of the whole car life thing and become more comfortable and stealthy, parking in different places and not being detected. I hadn't done any off-grid stuff yet, but was more comfortable by the time I'd reached Lake Tahoe. One day I was out hiking, and asked some local guy with his dog if he knew where I could sleep in my car, because Tahoe seemed tricky. He said there was a place up in the mountain called Hope Valley. It sounded good, so off I went. Now Lake Tahoe is already very high in altitude, so this was a few thousand feet higher than that. This was this past July, and as I reached the area I saw a small parking lot that was an entrance to a wildlife nature preserve. It was closed and empty, so that would do nicely. I was all settled in with my blanket, and the sun was setting as the temperature plummeted, and before I knew it, it was pitch black, and the visibility was 0. At this point I began to hear wolves howling. Yes, this was the experience I wanted. It was a little creepy, but I was fine. I was living what I would normally be watching on YouTube in my apartment. Before the sun went down, I noticed that there were overfilled garbage cans about 15 feet away from my car at the entrance to the preserve. Then I finally drifted off to sleep. Then later I was awoken by something at 3 a.m. But you couldn't see anything. It was pitch black out there. Then I heard footsteps, heavy ones, right outside my door. At this point I was absolutely terrified, being a New York City boy. Then something suddenly brushed up against the car. I didn't know what to do. I waited for a couple of minutes, then tentatively opened the door, ran around the car as fast as I could, and got in the driver's side. I booked it down the mountain and just slept in a Motel 7 parking lot like a baby. I never made it through my first and only off-car camping adventure, and I'll never forget it. The only other time during that trip did I see something creepy was in Mount Shasta. I drove halfway up the mountain, parked on the side of the road, got out and started walking into this trail. I made it about 70 yards in, when I heard a low growl. I'd never run so fast to get back to my car in my life. This is my account of a few creepy things that happened on a farm I used to live on. My stepmom had always loved the idea of living off the land and raising our own animals. So after many attempts at just that, we rented a house on a piece of land with an already established asparagus farm. Soon after came all the animals, and we had a good group of chickens, ducks, and a few rabbits. We let the birds free range, and never really had any issue with it. However, soon after raising our last batch of ducklings, 2 of our 4 adult ducks disappeared and left no trace, not a single feather. Though we lived in the country, we could see our neighbours, and at the very back of our property there was a creek that connected to our state river. So for a while we'd assumed that the ducks had just wandered off. However, one evening it had begun to rain, so we ran outside to make sure all the animals could get into their respective homes. But as we were checking everything, my stepmom and I heard a duck in the woods. We ran across the property, about an acre or so, down to the woods to see if it was our missing ducks. My dad and brother came down after with the guns to check the woods as we looked through the tree line. They headed off towards the creek and told me to whistle if I saw anything. I headed up the side of the property to check behind our barn, and my stepmom came back out of the woods as I made my way back to where we had all split up. Side note: the creek at the back of the property split off and a stream ran up the side of our house. As we were facing the stream, we could hear multiple whistles coming from the woods in front of us. Thinking it was my brother, we started looking around for him, being careful to not spook any possible ducks. After about 30 seconds, though, my dad and brother came running out of the woods from the opposite direction, asking us why we were whistling. My stepmom and I, both confused, said it wasn't us, and told them that we had assumed it was my brother. We all agreed it wasn't any of us, and were all with other people who could account for the other. The whistling had come from directly in front of us, with no sign of anyone being there, and there was no movement or sound, other than the whistling, which happened multiple times. Fast forward a week or so later, when a possibly related incident happened. I wasn't present for this one, but both my brother and sister were. It was around 8 in the evening, but it was the summer, so it was still light, and a bad storm was on the horizon. My brother and sister were watching the sky darken and turn grey, when they looked into the back of our yard, about an acre away, to see a man crouched down dressed all in white. Now my brother, being the guy he is, shot towards the figure after telling him to leave multiple times, then watched him run off. My sister said she'd seen him before my brother had, just standing behind our fence post staring at them. She'd only told my brother about it when the guy had moved, and she could clearly see the shape of a man. After having talked to my sister more about the encounter, she said that the man had an odd glow around him, and that made them notice him in the dark woods. Now, I'm not sure if this has anything to do with the stories, but when we moved out of that house, we found a bullet hole in our house that had gotten lodged in my dad's riding vest. It had come through my sister's window and into my parents' closet, and we'd heard the shot and seen a man running through the yard. But we didn't find the bullet or broken window until months later. It hadn't shattered the glass it had come through. I'm not sure if the stories are connected, but needless to say, my parents didn't like us going in the woods anymore. Let me know what you guys think. This happened around 6, maybe 7 years ago, and I was around 8 at the time. My first brother was just being born, and we shared a bedroom. We had only one window in that bedroom that looked out over a swampy lake, with thick woods nearby. My mum and I would often visit the lake, because there were around 3, maybe more alligators living there. Yes, I know, it was dangerous. but the alligators didn't seem to mind us much. We often fed them lunch meat, and never did I get the impression that they didn't like or want to be near us. There was one alligator in particular that got closer to us than the rest, and when I say close, I don't mean within arm's reach. I mean I think it was a she, would come out of the water to grab the meat, stare at us for a second, then go back. I was particularly fond of that one, as she seemed to be, I don't know, nicer. I could never put my finger on it. Anyway, we also live next to very thick woods. If you walked in a zigzag pattern for 10 minutes, there would be a very real possibility that you would have to climb the nearest wasp-ridden tree to find your way back to the house, which was the only one for quite some distance. Now the thing I wanted to really tell you about was why there were 2 alligators in the pond instead of 3. You see, a week before, one of the alligators went missing, and me and my mum noticed a putrid smell. It wasn't a kind of trash smell where you say ew and move on with your day. It was the kind of smell where you take one sniff and automatically cover your nose and have to gag. Sometime after this, we realized that we hadn't seen any game around. Sure, there were still birds, but there were no deer, which frequented the area often. There were no snakes, no lizards, nothing, and the smell was often accompanied with the birds making this deep, airy whoop sound. Me and my mum didn't want to think about why the birds could have made the sounds we heard, so we ignored it and passed it off as the woods being the woods. However, one night I was awoken by my baby brother whimpering, and me, being the caring big brother, went to console him. I picked him up and looked out the window as I hushed my brother, and as soon as he stopped crying, I could hear the faint but very clear hissing of an alligator and dragging sounds. Now I'm from Florida, so I can distinguish alligator noises from woods noises. There was nothing else in the woods that would hiss like that, so maybe the other alligators were fighting with each other. But this was the kind of hissing that sounded defensive, not offensive. Like there was a bigger gator somewhere near. But all the gators were the same size, at around 5 to 9 feet, I thought. Then all of a sudden the hissing stopped, followed by a distinctive, crunching, snapping sound, then dragging and chewing. But something else I noticed was this almost human shape that was about 8 to 9 feet tall. I want to say it was bigger, but me being 8 at the time, and the fact that people tend to exaggerate, prohibits me from doing that. But it seemed to be dragging something out of the pond and over its shoulders, something long and slender. So me being an 8-year-old child became obviously terrified, so I put my brother to bed with me and stayed up the rest of the night with my eyes trained through the window. The next morning when my parents went into my room to wake me up, they could see a sleepy and scared 8-year-old boy holding his baby brother and staring out of the window. When they asked what was wrong, I simply said, "Someone was outside." Immediately my dad went outside, gun in hand, as looters were a big concern of his for some odd reason, and he took me with him. We investigated the pond, but nothing was too out of the ordinary, except the gators were out of the pond. Looking round, we found something a few yards away from the pond, and as we got closer, we could see a fresh gator corpse. And by fresh, I mean that not even flies or buzzards had gone to pick at it yet. But one thing still confuses me to this day. We found a part of the gator's jaw. Not the whole jaw, but a distinct fragmented part of it, and I never saw my favorite gator again. So this takes place in and around Happy Valley, New York, and happened almost a decade ago. My buddy B and I have been fox and coyote calling for some time now. If you're unfamiliar with how it works, you place a wiggly fake critter somewhere, play some distress calls or mating calls out loud, and when the time is right, you take a shot. It sometimes happens quickly, sometimes happens within 10 minutes, but anything longer than that and you have to move on to the next area. This particular night, however, we came across something that, well, it scared the absolute crap out of us, and we've avoided that area ever since. We set up, jumped in the back of the pickup truck and started calling. We'd already gotten one grey fox each by this time and were hankering for another. Only this time the woods were unusually quiet. I remember my buddy mentioning how creepy it was, and we set up. And after about 10 minutes, we turned the caller down, listened, and took a look around. But nothing. He turned the caller up slightly, and suddenly, out of nowhere, we heard the most primal screech, call or cackle. Like those bird calls from the jungle. That's really the only way I can explain it. We froze. I could see in my peripheral that my buddy's eyes were wide open, darting back and forth, because like me, I thought it had come from behind and above us. The primal fear my body felt, though, wouldn't allow me to turn around. B turned down the caller again, and the fake critter was still spinning and flopping around. We were basically looking at each other in our peripheral vision to see whether the other had heard it. Then whoosh! We heard what sounded like heavy wings flapping a couple of branches above us. Then a rustle, and snap. We both did a 180, aimed our rifles at the same spot in the tree above us, only to see the branches slowly stop moving and a broken one swaying. Then there was a thump and a crash, and we both turned another 180, rifles fixed on the area they were before. Only instead of a fake floppy critter, we saw these massive, and all I could really make out were, well, wings. Huge, leathery, reptile-looking wings. Like an 8-inch wide bat. I'm still not sure. But we turned around just in time to see this thing jump off of the ground, flap its wings to gain altitude, and it was gone. Honestly, all I can picture is Man-Bat from Batman, the animated series. B and I sat there, rifles aimed, staring straight ahead, wide-eyed and breathing heavily, not sure what had just happened or what we'd just witnessed. When 30 seconds later, about 100 yards ahead of us, our fake floppity critter dropped down from the sky, landing on the side of the road. It had been mauled, mangled and crushed, and with a final screech, off in the distance, it was over. We waited about 30 minutes, retrieved the caller, and Scooby-Doo skedaddled out of there. To this day, we've convinced each other that we saw some sort of huge owl, and even if we joke about seeing something pterodactyly, there's still a serious minute where we basically tell ourselves to shut up, it was an owl, and took a break from calling for a while. Years later, and we're still hunting, trapping and calling. I now carry a harpoon gun with me every and any time I enter my local woods. That winged thing owes me a fake floppy critter, and in turn I will hunt it and put its ass in my trophy case. And yes, the spear gun and me carrying it is 100% real. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.